Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Is your cloud strategy headed in the right direction? We've got hot off the press reports, data here to be presented from the latest cloud protection trends study from Veeam. This is going to be really exciting. Thank you so much for everyone who's taken time out of your schedule to join us on the webinar today. We've got a great event lined up. Before we get started here, there's just a few things that you should know about the event. Of course, first, I want to say thank you to our friends from Dataprise and Veeam for joining us and supporting us on the webinar today. We encourage your questions there in the questions pane of the audience console. We'll be doing a live Q&A session at the end of the event, and we know how tough it can be out there in the world of IT and technology. You've got to do what you can do to better protect your data. And so we want to help you to overcome those challenges on the event today. We encourage your questions. As I said, we've even got a best question prize. I'll talk about that here in just a moment. I should mention, I suppose, my name is David Davis, and I'm serving as the host on the event today from ActualTech Media. We also have a number of handouts there in the Handouts tab. I want to call your attention to those. We've got a link to the brand new, just released 2023 Veeam Cloud Protection Trends Study Report. Just click on that first link. We'll be discussing that report here during the event. And then 3 PDF resources that you can download there: the CIO's Ransomware Checklist White Paper, the Cybersecurity Guide for Cloud Data Management, and the Enhanced Data Protection 2022 report. Make sure that you check out those resources. At the end of the webinar today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing would have already occurred, and the prize terms and conditions can be found there in the Handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have a special prize here on the live event for the person who asked the best question. That means you have to ask a question to be entered into the prize drawing, and we'll be selecting the prize winner for that Amazon $50 gift card after the event. Of course, you must meet the ActualTech Media prize terms and conditions as well. All right, so with that housekeeping information out of the way, I'm excited now to bring on today's expert presenters. Welcome to Jason Buffington, Vice President for Market Strategy at Veeam, and welcome to Mary Beth Hamilton, Chief Marketing Officer at Dataprise. Jason and Mary Beth, it's great to have you on the event. I'll first hand it off to you, Mary Beth. Take it away.
Perfect. Thank you. So thrilled to be here, and just some quick housekeeping, which I can't resist taking a minute to introduce you to Dataprise before we get into the conversation with the great findings from Veeam's Cloud Protection Trends Report. But so Dataprise, we are a leading managed service provider with a deep focus on, not likely surprising, cloud disaster recovery and cybersecurity. And then we complement those services with what we view as unrivaled managed user, managed service desk, field services, everything our clients need to be able to keep their operations running end to end and deliver what we like to view as a harmonious IT experience. So disaster recovery is one of our powerhouse services. We are thrilled that we are a Veeam Platinum level partner. And we also hold extensive certifications across the Microsoft stack as well, in Azure. So we think it's a perfect pairing for this conversation. And with that, Jason, over to you to start getting us into the great findings from the recent report.
Awesome. Thanks, Mary Beth. And before we go on past the Dataprise side, I will point out to you a little bit of a spoiler alert. One of the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at IaaS and SaaS and PaaS. We're going to look at BaaS and DRaaS. But one thing that you're going to see pretty consistent in the research is what customers are looking for as far as expertise goes. And so while I love your competency things, I certainly appreciate you being a Veeam partner. Although I have to say my favorite certification on there is the Veeam Vanguard. That is based on IT professionals who just give back to the local community. And the Vanguard is a pretty elite status. So if you're familiar with things like Microsoft MVPs and vExperts, it is that kind of accolade as well. So always a pleasure to work with someone who has one of the very few on site. So let's talk about the research. So at Veeam, I work in the office of CTO. And part of my job is I run all of our unbiased independent research. So this is not the findings of Veeam customers or Dataprise customers. I guess statistically speaking, there's a percentage of them based on market share. But what we do is we hire third-party research firms and we ask them, hey, here are the topics that we want to have a better understanding of. We want to know that for what products to build. We want to know that for how to do better messaging, and really just to kind of stay ahead of the curve for where the general market is going, to make sure that Veeam continues to lead in those markets. So for this piece of research, though, I've been in the data protection space for 32 years. And for a large part of that, there's often a disconnect between application owners and IT operations generalists and backup admins, right? They don't always have the same motivations, especially when it comes to things like backup. So one of the core designs with this project was to go survey 1,700 organizations, and specifically looking at each of the 5 personas that you see on that right-hand side. The goal being, do IaaS admins and SaaS admins and PaaS admins, do they agree or not as to how data should be protected? And if so, by what kinds of technologies along the way? I got to give props to Patrick. He actually gave the first question for the thing. Please do put your questions in. We also do want to know where you're from, because I think that's cool, especially if you're from Texas. But if you have technical questions or anything around the solutions and data that you see here, you can reach out on that. You can also download the full report and follow along if you like, on that left-hand side. So the idea was look at all the different personas and then try to compare, do they agree and disagree on adoption drivers, challenges, and most importantly, data protection strategies related to each and every one of these. So got a lot of data to cover. Let's go ahead and pile on. First one we want to look at is the maturation when organizations were first coming in. In fact, Patrick's question first was the idea of, how do you move to online? Is it, in his case, he was talking about SharePoint Online, which is part of M365. But I would think more pragmatically, a lot of organizations, when they first start embracing the cloud, and we're going to put that in air quotes and italics with an asterisk beside it, is they take either physical machines or virtual machines and they uplift those and simply replumb them. So it's lift and shift. So we take a workload and we pick it up and we move it over into the cloud. And then there's a maturation that happens before we actually get into native service delivery. So we wanted to find out, how is that going overall? And so one of the things we wanted to look at is the movement of workloads, not just to clouds, but also back again, because that's going to be the landscape that we want to look at. So a couple interesting points on here. Notice here it's roughly thirds, right? So about a third of the workloads that spun up in a cloud in the 12 months prior to the survey were migrated from physical machines within the data center. Another third migrated from virtual machines from that data center. And then about a third created net new. And I really like this. This is actually the second time we run this project. We had a project called Cloud Protection Trends 2021. So about 2 years ago-ish, and saw about the same basic math. And the things I like about that is, first and foremost, it's not 90% coming from the data center, right? So anyone who says the data center is dying, no, the data center is not dying, it's diluting. Because what we see is that organizations that are embracing cloud first are standing new workloads up when they make sense in the cloud when they can, right? And so as new workloads spin up disproportionately, that dilutes the percentage of your overall production infrastructure, which is still on-prem. But we know that organizations are not decommissioning data center workloads at 30% year over year, right? So we know that they're growing faster in the cloud than they're decommissioning on-prem, and that's how we get this dilution thing. But Mary Beth, before we pile in on this, the slide says there and back again. So let's talk about the back again. So one of the things that we thought was really interesting here is that some organizations presume, or maybe assume, that the journey to the cloud is a one-way street, and it's not. In fact, if the orange little wedge says 12% have never taken a workload from the cloud and brought it back on-prem, that means 88% have. In fact, I got to tell you, I noticed that most of the responses on today's web events are from the United States. When we cut this data by for the Americas, 99% Americas have relocated back. It's 88% globally. It's a little less than that. It's 78-ish in Europe, and then I forget what it is in APJ, but 88% globally have said, yes, I brought workloads back. And then when they answered yes to that, they got to answer one or more of the green boxes on the right. And you do get several different varieties of why. Right. There are some folks that, and this is my favorite, they did DR, right? So you failed over, like taking the spare tire out of your trunk. And then after you get the original tire fixed, you go back, right? And so you fail over to a cloud, you bring it back again. Next box over, there are some that have had what I call cloudy remorse, right? You stood up in the cloud and said, hey, turns out the cloud's not free, right? Costs money to run this stuff up there. Right. And similarly, by the way, they said, oh, it's not quite as performant for the people that are down the hall. Maybe I need to rehome this again. So there is a little bit of, let's call it cloudy remorse in some cases. And then lastly, there's a lot of organizations that their dev might start a workload in the cloud. But when it's time to go production, they say, actually, we dev'd it, say, in Amazon as an example. But then we want to run it on-prem because of performance requirements or sovereignty security requirements. Or maybe if you're an M365 customer, you have Azure credits committed every month. And so you might have dev'd it in Amazon, but you want to run it in Azure or vice versa. So lots of different repatriations to and back again. Mary Beth, from Dataprise has got a fantastic install base of organizations of all sizes. What are you seeing from your customers and the folks that talk to you?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's really sort of a dynamic environment that we're operating in as firms figure out what is that right mix from a hybrid perspective, and sort of taking it a step back of where we see clients starting their cloud journey or where they continue to evolve sort of matches with those three segments on the left, in that we see clients sort of looking at, okay, the natural place, do I have hardware that's going to be end of lifing? Do I have a major platform upgrading? Is that the right time to start looking at what I need to move into the cloud? And then there's the components of adding new applications, and it may be from the dev perspective that they want to start there. And then there are times that they say, okay, we'll do it in dev, but then also run it on-prem in production. And then there's the components of, as they continue to expand their offices and open, either relocate or open in new locations, that they take a look at, figure out, is the cloud, is that the time to utilize it? And then that fourth one is disaster recovery. And we often see clients that may not have a very cloud first strategy, taking that as their first step to utilizing the cloud. And so with all those different inflection points of where they're looking at moving and how they're utilizing it, incorporating it into their strategy, whether it be full cloud or hybrid or whatever that approach is, there are those learning steps along the way. And they may learn that securing it is more complicated than they anticipated. The one thing that we always say is the cloud is not secure by default. There are all these tools and capabilities that you can layer on, but you have to be thoughtful about how you're doing that. And it also goes to how you're protecting the data. So there's a lot of learning that we see undertaking along the way, and that is likely where there's those cases of figuring out it might be better on-prem. And so that's the right strategy at this time.
So I love what you said around the challenges around tools and security in particular. So Ted also asks an interesting question around this, where he talked about what are the monitoring challenges with hybrid. And I would tell you that, from our experience, a lot of the monitoring tools, if you're still the smartest person in the room and you're using your kinds of hodgepodge of tools, that can be really hard, especially because I've not met an organization recently that is single cloud. Right. So when we talk about a cloudy data protection strategy, you ought to be thinking about hybrid and multi. Right. So it's hybrid in the on-prem plus cloud, not or, but and. But then you also have to think about Amazon plus Azure plus Google. You have to think about Salesforce plus M365. You have to think about PaaS, database. I mean, it's a wide landscape, right? So it's not like, I spent 7 years at Microsoft. It's not like you just power up System Center, discover everything on raised floor, and you've got this great single picture, right? So most of those tools are not there yet. And every cloud has their own APIs for monitoring. It can be rather arduous, especially if the only thing you're doing is taking your existing data centers designer-centric skill set, simply acquiring some tools for their own sake. And then, as I said, you're still the smartest guy in the room. One of the things that you're going to hear a lot from me over time is I'm a huge fan of MSPs. It's why I like doing these kinds of web events, because you don't have to be the smartest guy in the room anymore. So, all right, but let's get back to some of the data. We're going to compare the results of 1,700 other smart guys and gals in the rooms, and so go from there along the way. But yes, please keep those questions coming along the way. All right. Also, I'm surprised by the number of folks who have all chimed in and said hello from rainy Dallas, Texas, rainy Wisconsin, rainy Georgia, actually. So evidently it's downpouring everywhere, which is a great recipe for disaster recovery. Just thought I'd point that out. All right. So we talked about the landscape that's there, and we shouldn't spend this much time on every slide or we won't get them finished. But one of the things we ought to look at is, who are the personas that are actually involved, right? That was a primary design criteria for the research overall. One of the things we've been monitoring for a while is there seems to be a growing number of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to defining the strategy. And I got to say, I really like this. So even we ran this research 2 years ago, central IT is almost always at the head of the table. And yet you saw a significant diminishing of return between cloud admins participation and backup admins participation, et cetera. I like the fact you're seeing a more even balance of those roles, because when it comes to protecting something as complex and diverse as cloudy infrastructure, it does take a village, right? It does take a variety of different folks out there. Hello from sunny Santa Barbara. Way to rub it in. You can almost always count on a Californian for that. All right, so lots of folks deciding the strategy. That said, I love the fact that when we ask organizations who's actually clicking the mouse when it comes to protecting cloudy infrastructure, there's actually a pretty healthy mix. Now, there's actually two versions of this chart. Only one shows up in our deck for today. When backup as a service is not involved in protecting either IaaS or PaaS, then it's still roughly just over 2-to-1 between the backup team and the cloud administrators. When the IaaS or PaaS environment is also using backup as a service, you see that's what the chart's represented here, that in that case, about 1 in 4, the BAS team is responsible for actually monitoring and managing the protection jobs. And then, oh, by the way, that erodes from both sides. And the rest is still just over 2-to-1 between the backup team and the cloud administrators. Mary Beth, this has been kind of a significant shift. It wasn't not that long ago that you would actually seen more cloud admins than backup admins actually doing the backups of the cloud.
Yeah, and so what stood out to me, and I mentioned this to you earlier, well, two things. One I didn't mention, one I'm going to mention now, is that the shift in organizations and that specialization, and the fact that as an organization continues to grow and build out those specializations internally, it does make sense that it's continuing to move more from one role to the other. And I will let you comment on that in a minute. But what I like more is that that DRaaS service providers on the right-hand side portion, and obviously we're huge proponents of seeing that continue to grow, and talking about the complexity that is continually added through this. That is one of the reasons that we're finding that organizations are using services like ours, so that they can tap our expertise and then deploy their internal resources to higher value projects.
So let me talk about the shift. So as I said, I've been in backup for 32 years in one field or another. My last gig before I joined Veeam was I was actually an industry analyst. So all I did was run research and look at what's changing within the organization overall. And we have seen a significant shift. This is not a unique phenomenon though. So let's roll the clock back 15 years, right? When virtualization was brand new within the data center. And back then, what you found is that you had the generic backup admin was responsible for everything in the data center except the VMs. And the reason was because when they first tried to do it, they just stuck an agent inside of every VM and it didn't work very well. So the virtualization admin said, look, this is a different kind of platform. It has different kinds of needs. I understand VMware 1.0 way back in the day, right? So I will handle the backup of the VMs because I need a separate kind of tool for that. And by the way, that's how Veeam got started. Fast forward, though, there's never been an application owner that said, when I grow up, I want to be a backup admin, right? That is not a thing, right? So instead, what you found was when the tools were mature enough and the APIs were stable enough that the application owner could give that responsibility back to the team that actually knows what backup should look like, right? And so that's what you see is that shift where it used to be mostly cloud admins because the tools were nascent, the complexities were there, the backup admin couldn't barely spell AWS. I mean, that was a problem. As the tools became more mature, as the expectations are there, they can give that back to the backup team. That said, and you called me for this earlier when we were looking at this in the pre-show. It is completely reasonable that while the momentum is that the backup team should be backing up everything, regardless of on server or service, you should also expect that in large enterprises within the backup team, there will be some specialization. So within the backup team, they all know how to do backups, but there'll be some folks that are more cloudy than others. There'll be some folks that are more databasey than others. Some folks are more endpointy than others. I just made up 3 new adjectives. You're welcome.
There you go.
So that is that shift in that paradigm. But at least bottom line is if the backup team is doing it, or if the Baz and Draz team is doing it, at least they're getting done. And if you're waiting for the app owner to do it, that may not always be the case. All right, let's talk about a few other cases where there might be some deficiencies now. And I want to high speed you through a couple of these and then bring back the conversation. So the good news is that you're seeing this paradigm shift. The backup admins are more in charge. It's more likely the backups are actually occurring. I love the fact that Baz service team members are also part of that math. Here's where we see a problem, though. When organizations were asked, how long are you keeping the data from your cloud-hosted workload, so IaaS and PaaS in production, you can see here only about half of organizations are even keeping their backup data for a year. And again, I think the problem there is, look, if you have corporate data that has a 5-year retention mandate on it, that's a 5-year retention mandate on it, whether you're using servers or services, right? The problem, though, is if you've been relying on the app owner to do the backups, in many cases, they don't care about things like retention. They care about the undo log, right? They care about yesterday, not 2 years from now, right? Or life of patent, or life of patent, or SOX, or HIPAA, or et cetera. So I do think there's a hole here. I think the fact that the backup admin and the Baz team are becoming more and more involved means when we run the survey again in 18 months, you should expect to see, hopefully, this curve is 18 months longer. One thing I will point out, though, is of those organizations that are holding data even a year, I really like the fact that there's a variety of platforms that are holding this stuff on. So in some cases, they're going cloud to cloud, right? Or region to region within a hyperscale cloud. Can't help but notice the number 2 most common repository for IaaS and PaaS backup data is a Baz provider, right? So I love the idea of one cloud protecting another. Although I will point out those lime green wedges on the bottom there, I think it's fantastic organizations understand that not only is backup services not a tape killer per se, there's still a relevant usage as a minority of data for tape, but I like the idea that service providers are providing tape as an option, right? Because if I have data that has to have 50 years of retention on it, life of patient, life of patent kind of things, I like tape. For those kind of scenarios as a minority opinion. All right, let's talk about a few more holes, and then I want to hear the Dataprise answer to the problem. And that is, let's look at, we talked about infrastructure. Let's look at platform, because as I mentioned at the beginning, for a lot of organizations, their journey to the cloud is, first, I'm going to lift and shift. I'm going to take server images and VMs. I'm going to take them from physical data centers. I'm going to drop them into server instances in AWS, in EC2, in Azure hosting, in GCP Workplace. The line goes on from there. The problem is that just like we've seen with every other as a service offering, as you move further down that maturity curve, you eventually get to, why would I run a Windows server with a file share in it when I could just run a managed file share right from the hyperscale cloud? Same thing for databases. Why would I run SQL inside of a Windows VM inside of a hosting service when I could just run Azure SQL, right? So that is the paradigm shift as we look towards PaaS for file and PaaS for database. The problem is that many organizations presume, incorrectly, assume that because the service is natively durable, that you don't have to back it up. And in fact, in this case, this is some bad news. 1 in 5 organizations say, in this case, I'm a fan of Azure File as one scenario type. 1 in 5 Azure File environments say, we don't back it up because it's natively durable. Well, that means if I go and overwrite a file, if I delete a file, it gets overwritten or deleted everywhere. All of its natively durable copies, and it's just gone, right? Still got to have previous versions. Certainly if you, Mary Beth, once upon a time, you and I used to do double take together 20 plus years ago-ish. And same problem, right? You'd replicate data from one server to another. And if you overwrote something, it overwrote everywhere. If you deleted, if you ransomware, right? You still need previous versions along the way. In this case, only about 3 in 5 organizations are actually backing up their files that are running in a PaaS-based environment. Now, that said, of those 60% that are doing that, I think it's interesting. This mix is actually very indicative of what we saw in early virtualization, in early Windows. And that is that when you first adopt the platform, you tend to embrace the native utility that comes with that platform. I said I spent 7 years at Microsoft. One of the things I used to run was the NT backup utility inside of Windows, right? No one today would say that is adequate for protecting a Windows server, right? But it's built in. Surely it's good enough. No, it's not. Right. And so, but you start that way. And then you realize, oh, I need scheduling. I need versioning. I need smarter humans that can remotely monitor so I don't have to log into each machine and protect itself. All of those things that you don't get with the built-in utility, but it always starts there. I'm actually really loving the fact that it's almost an even mix for PaaS between protecting with their own self-managed tools and then protecting with BAS and DRAS. I'm going to fast forward one slide and you'll see the exact same results in databases. Thankfully, more people are backing up their PaaS databases than backing up their PaaS files, but the rest of the mix holds true, right? There's a few folks that think it's resilient. There's a few folks that think there's no data in them. I don't know who those folks are. Some folks are looking around, and then the majority, almost to the same math. About half of them are using that built-in utility again, almost like dump and scrape, if you're familiar with Oracle RMAN from many moons ago. Although in the case of databases, even more higher percentage are using BAS. And I think that's because for many organizations, there's a higher perception of the strategic value of the application when it comes from a structured application like a database, as opposed to unstructured data like file. And if it has more strategic value, you don't necessarily want to be the smartest person in the room backing that stuff up. Wouldn't it be nice if a BAS and DRAS provider knew how to spell PaaS, which is kind of my setup for you. Let's talk about what are the answers when we talk about IaaS and PaaS. What is the Dataprise answer to the problem?
So what we're showing here is what we're looking at is, looking at it holistically. And, as you touched on earlier, we are continuing to see, and, selfishly, we're going to keep wanting to see and drive it up, more organization using those managed BaaS and DRaaS offerings like we offer. And so what's highlighted here is all those core elements of disaster recovery that we deliver as a service to our client, from monitoring and management to security and testing, and then how we're able to do that across a diverse sort of data sense of as a service platforms. And the reality of it is I touched on that before, right? It's a hybrid world we're living in, and our data is also living in that as well. It might be multi-cloud, it might be a hybrid approach, but it's in many different places. But that doesn't mean that it can't be protected appropriately. So from infrastructure, IaaS to PaaS to SaaS. And when I say SaaS, from our perspective at this point, we're mainly talking about Microsoft 365 and protecting that data, but I know Veeam is continuing to make innovations there on how you can protect other SaaS applications. But we look at it as how do we holistically support our clients and help them protect that data across that diverse environment. And obviously that's where our partnership with Veeam plays a key role in how we're continuing to innovate, how we monitor it, manage it, protect it, and then layer on security components on top of it. And if we have an opportunity a little bit later on, we can touch on sort of that security components, but at a high level, these are the layers and the components from that managed DRaaS and BaaS perspective that we look to layer on regardless of where the data lives across all of these clouds, as you say. So back to you, Jason.
So one thing I really like about this diagram is it's about outcomes and processes and not tools, right? So at Veeam, we think of ourselves as, in many ways, just a tool manufacturer, right? So I have several DeWalt tools hanging up in the garage right now. Doesn't mean I can build you a fine cabinet. right? What it means is I have a tool, right? I don't have the expertise to unlock all the power that that tool can actually enable me to give in an outcome. And I'm really leaning into that a little bit because Rashini and then also Heath had some questions here around, the better practices around how Azure fits into this model. And I probably oversimplify it when I say, hey, that journey is from on-prem to hosted infrastructure as server instances, and then eventually getting into things like PaaS for file and PaaS for DB. That works really well if you're thinking about a standalone workload, right? So if you're just thinking about departmental directories, then something like Azure File or File Services, Managed File on AWS, or even something like NetApp ONTAP Cloud Editions. All of those can provide you an outcome that's, say, file-centric. When you have a more complex application, something where you've got web front end, some middle layers, some core databases, and then as Rashani asked, also, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly, also AD authentication kind of comes into that. In those kind of instances, you're having to think more about a multi-tiered app that includes authentication. I might not move that all the way into something like Azure DB or into managed file services, mostly because the fact that I probably want to protect it as a whole. Right. And that contextual understanding of how those pieces and parts go. And then let's go back to the diagram from Dataprise here. How are you going to monitor that? How are you going to test for that? Those kinds of plumbing, I probably want those to have the same, let's call it center of gravity. It's no different than if you're messing with multiple VMs on-prem, you want them to be the same hardware generation or VM instance generation. And the idea being that they could move around a little bit. And you want to monitor them as a whole. If you start refactoring parts of a multi-tier app, then the monitoring tools have to be more diverse to keep up with that. So in some of those applications, I like the idea of just embracing server instancing as a whole. In fact, one of the things that I just saw, Dataprise, congratulations, you just did another acquisition in your portfolio. And a big part of that was around hosting in organizations that don't have their own, you call them vCTOs, I think, the idea of actually providing that top layer expertise. And again, not thinking about tools, thinking about processes along the way for that. So yeah, so it is not a one size fits all on that. And when you're thinking about things like monitoring and management, you may not take that all the way to the end because most of those tools aren't there yet. And if I haven't mentioned before, one more reason why you might want to not be the smartest person in the room when you're embracing that part of the architecture. Thankfully, there's smarter humans out there. You just got to outsource for them. All right. So we talked about IaaS and PaaS. There's a third kind of workload. And Mary Beth, like Dataprise, for a lot of folks, when we talk about software as a service, the poster child for that happens to be Microsoft 365. And yes, there are others. Veeam just released our own Veeam backup for Salesforce. In fact, there actually is a whole nother research project just on Salesforce because we wanted to make sure we really understood those personas as well. And I will try to make sure that David Davis, I'll get you the URL for that one so we can get that added as additional material. But let's look at the poster child for SaaS, which is M365. And one of the dynamics that came out of that, this is a question we've been asking for several years, and that is, do you back up Office 365, right? Because it wasn't that many years ago, the majority answer was no, right? The majority answer was no, because, if I'm getting my M365 Exchange Online and files, et cetera, if I'm not getting them out of Redmond, I'm getting them out of Phoenix, or I'm getting them out of Dublin, Ireland, and I can't tell the difference, right? And so it is natively resilient. That doesn't mean that you don't need last month's version or last year's version. And so one of the problems is that assumption we talked about earlier, assuming that as a service is natively durable, and so it doesn't need backup, right? Thankfully, only 3% of respondents, you can see that on the very bottom, thankfully, only 3% still have that wrong, right? And I know in marketing, we always say, there's differences of opinion. No, you're wrong, right? Resiliency is not a replacement for backup. And I apologize for any of the 3% that I just offended. Also, the recycle bin, right? That used to be the majority opinion, right? But here's what happened. People that early on said, oh, the recycle bin is good enough. I can roll that back 14 days. 14 days doesn't cover you when you have, last month's budget file, and then I overrode it with this month instead of doing save apps, right? 14 days doesn't cover the, hey, I was cleaning out some directories and I just found out I got to have that stuff back, right? 14 days doesn't do that. And most organizations didn't go back and say, oh, I'll ratchet that to 30. I'll ratchet that back to 45. Because if you need data from 5 years ago, I guarantee you did not set your recycle bin for 5 years. Didn't happen, right? Now, to add to the complexity, though, there's certainly there's multiple tiers of Microsoft 365, formerly Office 365, and some of them have concepts like legal hold and e-litigation tools. But to be clear, that locks a mailbox so that you can't violate it for chain of custody and discovery events and those kinds of things. And you get to keep paying for it as is for as long as you have to hold it, right? And I'm not bashing those things. I'm just pointing out it's not a replacement for backup. In fact, what a lot of folks don't understand, if you haven't gone and looked at E3 5, there's a huge amount of great value add on the security side, on the identity management side. There's a lot of other stuff that comes in those premier tiers that has nothing to do with data protection and yet adds value to the 365 ecosystem. We have that same proud Microsoft partner logo that you do, Dataprise, and we're not competing there. It's just not backup. Right. So with that in mind, I do love the fact that this is actually the first year the research shows more than 50% are using either a third-party backup product or a BaaS service or both. And if I haven't said it in the last 15 minutes, I'm a huge fan of one cloud protecting another, especially when there are smarter humans involved. This really leans into that. Mary Beth, you and I have both been in the Microsoft ecosystem in different roles over the years. Can we? What are you hearing from a Dataprise perspective?
So when I looked at this, what stood out is that we are still talking to companies and educating them on why they have to back up their 365 data. So I love that your survey shows a very high percentage in adoption of that, but we are still finding it is a regular thing that we are educating on and moving clients on, that we are finding gaps where they don't have that data protected. So I don't think it's a drum we can stop beating yet, because I think there continues to be this perception that if it is in the cloud, it is backed up, it is resilient, and we know that that's not the case. So it's fabulous that over the last 2 years, the results have really moved forward to show that that education is taking hold. But I still believe, and we are seeing firsthand, that companies are still sort of falling into that misconception and not protecting that data as they should.
Yeah, I think this is another one of those natural maturation curves that happens. Is originally what happens is the organization says, "Hey, natively resilient, probably don't have to back it up anymore." And then somebody actually reads the Microsoft EULA, and Microsoft EULA says, "Still your data, you got to back it up. We aren't." Right. And then there's a curve that happens after that where they think, legal hold and those kind of things, the recycle bin. And eventually what happens is some C-level says, hey, I need something back. And IT says, oh, we just figured it out. We don't actually have that. And the technical term for this is resume generating event, right? Where someone finally says, oh, I guess we should have been backing up our data. Who would have thought it? Everybody else. Everybody else thought you should be backing up your data. And so then what happens is that's where that curve happens. And a lot of organizations still are really in the early parts of that curve. If you're in year 2 of your 365 environment, I don't fault you for having that assumption. If you're in year 4, you've probably been burned and are now using a backup tool. Right. And that's just the natural maturation of that. And we see the same thing in SaaS. We saw in PaaS, and we saw the same thing in IaaS. No, by the way, we saw the same thing in virtualization and, all the way back. Right. So this set of questions never goes away. There are, by the way, speaking of questions, there are a couple that are in there as well. So Adam brings up some great points around changing cloud costs versus hardware costs on-prem. So I have another research project that we do. It's actually the largest of its kind anywhere in the industry. It's called the Data Protection Trends Report. Last year, we did 3,400 responses around 28 countries around the world. One of the things that we looked at in that particular project was looking at the fact that the cloud is not always cheaper. Right? If you're buying the cloud because you think you're going to save overall money in the very bottom line, that's not guaranteed to be true. In fact, that said, you get more economic value and you get more agility out of clouds, not necessarily, hey, it's always guaranteed to be cheaper for me. Pair that with the idea that, as we talked about in several other questions, this Mary Beth, y'all need to get in this business because there are several people here all asking about cloud cost monitoring and cloud efficiency. And oh, by the way, I'd add to that, put the right workloads in the right clouds for the right reasons, which means you have to understand the business and the clouds as well, almost as if you needed virtual CTOs. I mean, because they could help with, stuff like that. But so great questions on that. I would also point out to you, and Mary Beth, I don't know if you're going to address this or not. One of the things I actually really like about the Dataprise BAS model, and I used to work with Global Data Vault before your acquisition of them. I like the fact that a lot of your marquee customers, the first thing that happens is they get an on-premise appliance, right? Because no one ever said that black boxes with blinky lights was bad. They just didn't want to provision them, maintain them, and monitor them. And so the fact that you can have that on-site high SLA experience and yet no longer have the monitoring and the management and the build out and the, everything else, to me is best of both worlds. So I don't think about cloud versus hardware in any conversation I have. So hopefully, Adam, that answers your question there. And while we're on it, Bob asks a question, can you protect clouds to other clouds? And the answer is absolutely yes. So you could protect, you can add a cloud storage layer to a backup solutions protecting from the other cloud. So, one hyperscale to another. You can protect, Dataprise protects Amazon and Azure and M365 back to their cloud. And frankly, by the way, you can even twist it completely around and run some backup solutions on-prem in your private cloud and protect the public clouds back again, right? So it looks like there's a lot of arrows in that one along the way. So, all right, let's.
And real quick, Jason, before you go on,
yeah.
I want to jump on that, the cost one, because you're 100% going to the cloud is not a cost play, and we educate that on a lot. I know early on the perception was it was all about cost savings, but I do want to note that we, as well as others in the market, have a pretty sophisticated way to be able to run assessments. We follow Microsoft's best practices. So you can figure out what your utilization looks like, what your consumption is going to be. So you can build that cost modeling to really understand, does it make sense to lights out if you're in a data center, depending on what you have, or does on-prem make sense? So there's a lot of tools and capabilities that you can get a better handle on what those costs would look like so that you can run those types of assessments and have hard data around that. So I just wanted to make that note.
Totally agree. And we should probably go even further and just recognize the fact that, if you think about like what a large enterprise does versus say a small or mid-sized business, a large enterprise, because of efficiency and scale, right? They're having a consolidated set of data centers, a consolidated set of licenses. They have smarter humans that they can work on multiple landscapes at once, as opposed to if you're a small or mid-sized business, you got your hardware with your software with your expert, right? And that cost model, you absolutely do get efficiencies of scale, which is why enterprises can back up the same stuff cheaper than small businesses. And from that perspective, honestly, a backup as a service provider looks like an enterprise, right? Because you have all those efficiencies of economy of scale from the expertise and the licensing models and the hardware. You get all of that like you do on an enterprise on steroids, which is why small businesses so often embrace backup as a service provider, because you get those economic benefits right away. You also happen to get smarter humans, and arguably you get better tech, right? SMBs tend to use rather low tech. Service providers like enterprises tend to go with more higher grade technologies, and they can still deliver them more cost effectively. So there is a balance there. Maybe you should do the Veeam pitch for the rest of the hour, and I'll do the MSP, because frankly, I think you have the more fun slides to talk to. All right.
You get a Veeam Vanguard when you go with certain managed service providers, which that is really hard to get on your own staff. So
there is, and I happen to know your Veeam Vanguard, and he's one of my faves. So, y'all have got a good one, no doubt, one of the few. All right, let's talk more about those personas. Good cue up, by the way, the personas and roles responsible for actually doing the backups themselves. So in general, kind of like we asked in the IaaS question, who's clicking the mouse, right? Who's responsible for running the backups? And you see almost the same mix, although I will point out, remember I said on the on IaaS and PaaS, backup admins are a little greater than 2-to-1 versus the app owner. In the case of M365, it's actually a little less than 2-to-1, still roughly the same math, but the proportion actually is significant. And the reason, and oh, by the way, in both cases, BAS does about a fourth of them, right? So the reason for that is if you haven't actually tried to back up M365, it's not like, you want to back up your Windows device, setup.exe, next, finish, and you got a good backup going. You can do that on your own Windows laptop. Right? You want to do that for 365. There's role permissions you have to do. Graph API has some fun things. You got to go through Azure AD to get permit. I mean, there's more to it, right? And so it would be reasonable, again, that's part of the maturation journey, and there's not all of that even Veeam or Dataprise can solve for you from a tech perspective, which is why you want to wrap services around it so you don't have to mess with it. That said, that's why you see that mix a little bit out there. I am going to point out, though, and as you think about your own data protection strategies, take a look on the right-hand side, because this is one of those questions where we do see actually two gaps or differences of opinion between what the M365 admins think, those are the bluish greens, versus what the backup admins think, which are the yellowish greens. And I'm going to point those out. Right-hand chart, just focus on that. Left-hand set of bars. When the organizations were asked, is the data center backup team doing it? There is a gap where the 365 folks think the backup team's doing it more than the backup team thinks the backup team is doing it, right? And this can very dangerously turn into well, I thought you were doing it. Well, I thought you were doing it, and no one was doing it, right? So whenever you see a gap, I mean, that's 14 points, right? Whenever you see a gap like that, there is the potential those two sides have made some assumptions. So be careful for that. On the other side, though, that's the bad point of view. The good point of view is I like the fact that the BAS team or the M365 team doesn't realize that the BAS and DRAS provider is doing it as often as the backup team does. To me, that shows good partnering. To me, that shows M365 says, hey, backups are working. Good job, guys. And the backup team's going, I outsourced that. Just don't tell anybody, right? And if you have a good MSP partner, that should be that seamless of an extension of your own team. So I like the gap on the right, the gap on the left. Just make sure somebody knows who's backing that stuff up because 14% of y'all are wrong. All right. A couple last things. Let's talk about motivations here. So when we talk about primary reasons to back up, I promise you, even in 2022, if I go to a half a dozen Oracle DBAs, on-prem mission critical apps folks, and you ask them, what's the primary reason why you as a DBA back up your data? They will tell you it's because in case I blow up the schema, in case I do a bad import, I got to get it back to a couple hours ago. And that's a lovely thought. But if they're the ones responsible for doing the backups of Oracle, I promise you are not maintaining regulatory compliance because they're thinking about yesterday and the litigator is thinking about 5 years ago. So you always want to check and see what are the primary motivations between the app owners and the backup team. And in this case, I love the fact that the top three are the top three. There's pretty good alignment across those, and both sides agree. Both sides agree. The reasons you back up M365 is in preparation for cyber. In fact, Kenneth is bringing up a point around ransomware variants right now, so we can talk about that in a second. Regulatory compliance, top of mind for both sets of organizations. And yeah, I'm a little bit happy to see that both sides seem to understand that the built-in function is insufficient. Mary Beth, when you have conversations and you're talking to customers, I know you said that some of your prospects are still in the early days and you have to help them understand that M365 still needs to be backed up. Once you get through that part of the conversation, what are the primary concerns they have with their 360 environment? What are they trying to protect against or for?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, and we touched on this, if they're not doing it, is that the data is so prevalent across and in so many different places, from Teams to SharePoint to OneDrive, that when we talk about this, 365, them recognizing that there was a lot of data residing there that they need to protect and likely definitely critical to the business. The other one, and this question came in around ransomware, it is also protecting against cyber threats and cyber incidents that can be occurring. I mean, Veeam, you did a report earlier this year, and I think
Yep.
over 70 companies had some type of ransomware incident. So the fact that the threat landscape has changed dramatically, we're no longer just protecting against storms and rain and snow and earthquakes. We are now have a whole new threat landscape that we're protecting against. And it's that education component of cyber and DRAS, we say, are two sides of the same coin. So the strategy has to be integrated. And that's that continued education point of how does DRAS and BAS fit into their full business resiliency strategy and approach. So, once we've educated on them that the data is not protected, you may not be able to get it. It's then how does that tie into how you're safeguarding your organization and protecting against things like ransomware, where backup may be your only way to resume operations or get your data back.
So I want you to double click on that in just a second, but I also know that we got 9 minutes left, and I want to make sure we also get Kenneth's question answered. So Kenneth is asking around, can ransomware encrypt, say, a Veeam backup file? And the answer is yes, right? So it depends on where that file lives, which is why, as a software-based solution, we partner with different kinds of immutability or air gapping technologies wherever they are. So you can do immutable storage or worm type storage on-prem. And so there are appliances that'll offer you that. You can do, say, go to an Amazon S3 encrypted or immutable bucket. So you can be immutable, certainly air gapping, nothing more air gappable than tape along the way. And I know we don't have time for this, but hopefully someone from Dataprise reaches out to Kenneth, because you actually have a more enhanced version of protected storage, even than what Veeam offers. You provide an additional layer beyond that. So yes, so if it's just stored on a native NAS file share, like any other share, you can put it through a meat grinder. They can't actually get into a Veeam encrypted file because it is Veeam encrypted, but you can take steak and turn it into hamburger, and then take that hamburger and put it right back through the grinder again, and it'll never look like steak. Right. So having that multi-layer immutability all through the data lifecycle is absolutely something you should be thinking about from an architecture. And I will make sure in the chat that we also include the URL for that ransomware report, so you can see how other organizations are doing it as well. All right, Mary Beth, we got just a few minutes left. Let me do this. Let's talk through, say, 2 more slides from the research itself. And then give you the rest of the time to tell the rest of the Dataprise story. Does that work?
That sounds perfect.
One of the things that we looked for is we wanted to ask organizations what's driving the consumption of BAS and DRAS overall. And again, unbiased, these aren't Veeam nor Dataprise customers. But one of the things I thought was really interesting here as a math set is the idea of when it comes to BAS, it seems like most of the value that folks are looking for is certainly survivable data, right? Get your data out of the building, have it in another repository. As we just mentioned on the last conversation, can you see if the is the data recoverable? Is it in an isolated format? And so certainly that's survivability, but then other than that, it's operational efficiency. When we look at DRAS, though, and in fact, I've got this really cool coffee mug here. It says, "Why BAS when you can DRAS?" Right? So, and when you look at that from this perspective, when you look at what folks are doing for DRAS, it's not just survivable data, right? It's around that expertise of implementation. It's around the expertise of developing the plan. It's around offering expertise so that your own experts can go do other things. I got to say, I think folks got it right on this one, that DRAS really takes the power of BAS and unlocks it through those smarter humans and those smarter processes. And that seems like a great segue into all the things that Dataprise offers.
I know this hour is going by quickly, and there's so much more findings. Luckily, Jason, you've got a report, and you're going to be on the circuit here still, so people can find out more. Yep.
So let's give it the last few minutes on this. We want to talk about your sets of offerings along the way. You want to talk us through the DRAS pieces, and then last thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll just keep it pretty high level here. I think we've hopefully gotten it through sort of what our take is on how we approach DRaaS. And, we view it as a fully managed service. It's one of the advantages that we bring to our clients. The fact that we can manage everything for them. We can be a partner depending on where they are in their journey. We're obviously huge competencies in Veeam, which we then extend that value to our clients. And so it's in addition to us delivering it as a managed service, but how we then, to the ransomware question that came up earlier, how we've built what we call enhanced data protection, which sort of takes Veeam's insider protection and takes it to a next level with a near gap technology. So we're really able to add additional protection from ransomware perspective. And then the way we handle our monitoring and reporting, we've really built out sophisticated and mature processes around that to help our clients be more effective in how they are protecting their data. And then finally, someone had asked about testing. Testing is hugely important. I think everyone across DRaaS would say that as well, but we incorporate it into our offering and support clients through that, because if you can't test, if the data's not good, it's not going to do you any good in an incident. And then my last one here, just to, as we've alluded to the fact that beyond our powerhouse services around DRaaS, we aim to bring a holistic sort of end-to-end approach to our clients, so we can support them across their technology roadmap appropriately for this conversation. DRaaS is right up there at the top, but then also on the left-hand side there, we have deep competencies in cloud and cyber. Those three continue to merge as organizations transform. So it's really a growing area where we continue to assist our clients. And then on the right-hand side, it's the components of how we support organizations from their end users to the consulting services and the whole host. So as I noted, we aim to be that end-to-end partner and can support clients, whether they just want to utilize us for our DRaaS services or take advantage of that broader spectrum. We're able to support their technology operations in that respect.
Cool.
So 3 minutes, back to you, yep. Jason.
Also 3 minutes. So just one last thing that I'll plug is we've also seen some questions come through on, can I get copies of the slides or copy of the charts? The whole reason, as I said before, that Veeam does this research or contracts this research out more specifically is to create better conversations, right? Are we building the right products? Are our partners offering the right solutions and outcomes? And then hopefully also help you have better conversations with your peers. Right. So if you're a backup person, go talk to your IaaS and PaaS person and say, hey, here's what, 1,700 folks say. Does this line up with our strategies? And have some good dialogues from that. We've also got research on ransomware and Salesforce and other macro trends. Use that as a way to create other conversations. To make it a little bit easier for you, the QR code in the bottom actually does take you to the this latest set of research on the cloud protection trends for 2023 that just went live yesterday. So hopefully that's helpful. And Mary Beth, always a pleasure to work with you. And also the folks at Dataprise as well. So thanks for having me on today's call.
We are thrilled to have gotten to share your research so quickly to when it drops. So Jason, thank you as always for being a supporter and partnering with us on this.
David, you want to wrap it up and bring us home?
Yes, sir. Yeah, Jason, Mary Beth, excellent conversation, excellent detailed report here. I learned a lot. I know the audience did as well. So thank you for all your insight. Of course, thank you to Dataprise and Veeam for joining us on the event today. I encourage everyone to check out the report. The link to it is right there in the top of your handouts tab, or as Jason said, use the QR code if you have your mobile device handy and scan that QR code, or just click on the link in the top of the handouts tab as well. That report is available for download now, just released. Also, don't forget about the 3 PDF resources available for download there as well in the handouts tab. And before we go, I should announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. This is going out to Josh Griffith from Iowa. Congratulations, Josh Griffith from Iowa. And of course, thank you to everyone who submitted all the excellent questions today. We will be reaching out to our best question prize winner as well after the event. Of course, thank you to our friends at Dataprise and Veeam. Thank you to the audience. I hope you learned a lot, and have a great day and have a great weekend. We'll see everyone next time. Take care. Bye-bye.